Welcome. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Please take your seats so we can start the program. Thank you. My name is Beth Kubriel, and I have been asked to give some welcoming remarks this morning, and also to invite you to please start eating your lunch and to feel free to eat during the presentations. It is my honor to welcome you all for a critical and timely conversation about the global threats and opportunities facing our country today, and how America's role in the world matters more than ever to our local communities, especially to us here in Texas. I am delighted to be here today with our Congressman, Michael McCaul, and I thank the U.S. Global Leadership Council Coalition for bringing us together this afternoon. The USGLC has assembled a powerful group of nearly 200 leaders from around the state to form the Texas Advisory Committee. We are Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, pillars of the business and faith communities, humanitarians, civic officials, and military veterans. And we have all arrived at the same conclusion. America must continue to be a global leader. Looking out at you all right now, including a record number of elected officials, some of whom have votes this afternoon and may need to leave our program a little early, I can see that everyone in this room understands how interconnected our security and our prosperity are with the rest of the world, and that America is still and will always be an indispensable nation. You may have noticed that the President's budget was released just last week, at a time when America's role in the world is being debated in Washington and at kitchen tables across the country, not to mention amid the ever-growing number of global crises. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that stakes have never been higher for America's global leadership. Pulling back, especially now, is simply not in our nation's interest. And that is why we are so looking forward to today's respectful and bipartisan dialogue, and it is why we will not tolerate any disruptions in the program. These are not Democratic or Republican issues. These are issues that affect all Americans, and we hope that when you leave here today, you continue this vital discussion and share what you have learned about America's role in the world with your family, friends, and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Liz Schreyer. I'm the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and I'm so delighted to welcome you and to join you in Austin. Beth, it's wonderful, and thank you for kicking us off. I really want to thank all of you for being here, because this is going to be a fantastic conversation, and I know we're in for a treat. I want to thank the people that really made today possible. First and foremost, our partners that are part of what put this all together. They're listed up here on the screen, as well as our national partners. There are businesses and NGOs that make up what we call our global impact partners. They're the ones that help make sure that we have these conversations literally all over the country. And the third group that made this possible is a lot of people in this room that make up, as Beth called them, our Texas Advisory Committee. They're listed in the program. There are almost 200 business, faith, NGO, community leaders. They're led by our co-chairs, Henry Cisneros. We had to let one of them go, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, but we're so proud of her as she represents this country in Brussels as NATO. And so let's just give a big shout out for all the people that helped put today together. Now, the real excitement, of course, is our keynote that we're looking forward to hearing from and then joining us on the panel. Congressman, I get to visit with you in Washington. Congressman McCaul, if you don't know, everybody listens to you when you are in Washington, not only in the national capital, but on the global stage. I just did a visit of all the freshmen. I didn't personally go to all the freshmen, but the USGLC did what we call Freshman Lobby Day. And as I walked around and I showed many of your bills that we're going to talk about today in the international front, and all I had to do was say, Congressman McCaul is co-sponsoring, the leader of this bill, they would say, across the political spectrum, I'm in. If he's on it, then I'm in. And when you speak and you're so thoughtful and so smart on all the issues that we're going to talk about, they listen, and we're so proud to be here in your home district with you. So thank you for joining us. And it's why we listen, and a little bit about who the USGLC is, and then you're going to understand why we listen to your congressman. We are known in Washington and around the country as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. And we got that name and the tag, the Washington Post called us that one time, because we bring a pretty unusual group together. We are over 500 businesses and NGOs, everything from businesses like right here, Dell and Lockheed Martin and Walmart and Procter & Gamble, and big international NGOs, CARE and World Vision and Save the Children. We have a bipartisan advisory committee, a lot of folks right here from the great state of Texas, but almost all the living former secretaries of state and former secretaries of defense. We are very proud that we have over 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. We live in every state and so proud to, of course, be associated with the great state of Texas. And what we engage, what brings all of these folks together, is we believe that America needs to be a leader in the world to advance our national security, our economic interests, and our values. And to do that, we need to not only have defense, which is a military to keep us strong, but we also have to invest in development and diplomacy. In the budget, our federal budget, that makes up about 1% of our entire federal budget. A lot of people call it the foreign aid budget. It's actually more than the foreign aid. It is foreign assistance, but it includes our State Department, both the bricks and mortars and people who work as our diplomats. You're going to meet an amazing one today on stage. It also includes Peace Corps. It includes the aid workers that go out there to make sure that Ebola doesn't cross its shores. It includes the programs that we're going to talk about today that make sure we're opening markets in emerging countries. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about how these programs really matter here in Texas. And that is the topic that we really wanted to bring home and have a conversation, is why leading globally really matters locally. So I want to start this conversation actually with all of you. I know we're eating, there's a lot of stuff on the table, but somewhere on your tables there's a little card. And I want to take just 20 seconds, maybe 30, for you to write something real quick that hits your mind. When I ask you the question of why leading globally matters locally, why you think leading globally matters locally, and write the first thing that comes to your mind. Why leading globally matters locally here in Texas, here in Austin. First thing. Hopefully there's pencils on the table. Can we find them? There are. Emily promises me there are. You don't have to put your name on it. I will collect them because I do want to know your thoughts. There is a reason I'm asking. It's going to be part of our conversation today. Okay. Well, some of you are still writing, but how many of you said something that has to do with national security? Who wants to share one? Jennifer. Oh, I got you right when you're shooting. Sorry.
I just said security and prosperity.
Security and prosperity. Well, I'll catch you on the security. How many, the people who said security, others had security? Todd, what'd you say?
I said security.
You said security. So security, we're going to talk about it, is that in your packets when we put on it, is that a big group of combatant commanders this week, actually last week, said that this is really important to our security to invest in development and diplomacy, and we're going to talk about that today. How many of you said something? You said economics. Who else said economics? A whole bunch of you. Susan, what did you say?
I said a future for my children and future generations in our state.
In our state. Because that we know, and we're going to talk about that 95% of the world's consumers live outside of this country. The president of UT, we were just talking about that as well. How many of you said something about it's the right thing to do? It has to do with our humanitarian values. Anybody say that? A few of you said about that. So we're going to talk a lot about how that really matters. And I'm going to just end with a story to illustrate what this all and how this all connects to here in Texas. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of going to sub-Saharan Africa. Any of you been there? Any of you been to Zambia? Few of you. So you might relate to this story. So we were supposed to go to schedule. The first one is going to talk about is national security, the people who raise your hands on national security. We were supposed to go to Kenya. We didn't go to Kenya because there was a bomb attack in a hotel. Remember that? That was a hotel that where Westerners go. We didn't go to Kenya, but we went to Zambia. One of the first places we went to was an amazing peacekeeping mission where I saw the State Department training Zambia military, 1,000 of them, that were about to be deployed in one of the most difficult places on the continent of Africa, Central Africa Republic, not just to protect their security, but to protect our own. And we're going to talk about how our investments protect our security. Economics. I got off the plane in Lusaka, Zambia, the capital, and this is true almost anywhere in the developing world, and guess what I saw? Here's a picture of it. A swanky glass new airport made by China. Great power competition. Your congressman does a lot on this, and we're going to talk about it, is making sure that USA has the ability to compete against our competition that's out there. And third and finally is those people who said, why do we compete? Why do we engage in the world? Is humanitarian. There are so many stories I can tell, but I'm going to tell you my favorite. My favorite is a lot of you know about PEPFAR. PEPFAR is our program that started by a great Texan named George W. Bush. It was our fight against HIV/AIDS that has now saved 17 million people. And the first effort on PEPFAR was all about saving lives. I got to see PEPFAR 2.0. It's a program called DREAMS program. It is not just about saving lives, it's about giving life. And what I saw is I met this young girl. Here's a picture of this young girl. What I heard, she was abandoned by her mother at age 13. By age 15, she had HIV/AIDS, she was homeless, and she had 2 children. This DREAMS program captured her. She now is healthy, she is safe, she has a fashion design business, as she proudly told me, and she has a future. This is America at its best. And what I have learned is here in Texas, both UT, Rice, Texas A&M, a lot of the nonprofits that you're going to hear about, businesses here are partnering with the international affairs budgets, this little 1%, and are making a difference with global health programs, with agriculture programs, all kinds of programs that are making a difference in advancing our national security, our economic interests, and our values. That's why leading globally makes a difference to our local interests. But if you don't believe me, here are a few pretty important people that are going to just share some of the reasons why it matters.
Nobody in the world wants to see war less than the military does.
We've learned over the past 16 years of war that while military action is necessary, it is not always sufficient. In fact, most of the time, it's not sufficient.
It takes the development folks, it takes the diplomats, and it takes the military to achieve our national security objectives.
Those of us who have joined the National Security Advisory Council have done so with a history of service and commitment to this country.
We have been in locations where we see the importance of coming together to produce long-term stability. When USAID shows up globally, the Department of State, the Peace Corps, when programs are in place that address those basic needs of food, education, clean water, health, then those things contribute to a more stable society.
I think it's important that those of us who have seen firsthand the benefits of diplomacy and development in supporting our military objectives speak out.
I am for the State Department. I am for AID.
When we appear on television, or we go out on the road and talk to the American people.
Traveling to Africa with policy advisors so that we could demonstrate the value of the foreign aid budget.
We can go out and make the case that this is actually a high return on investment endeavor.
We owe those in the State Department, those in AID, certainly those in the military, the resources to achieve the missions that have been assigned to them.
One of the visits we made to Capitol Hill, I started off by saying to the senators that we met with, it may seem to you an anomaly that a military guy is up here arguing for the foreign aid budget, but we've seen the impact that it makes.
It's a privilege to be part of the USGLC, to be associated with like-minded individuals who realize that the military can't go it alone.
Now that I am out of uniform, I'm happy to be a part of a team that promotes those things for America and our friends around the globe.
Wow, what a great video. Hey, as a veteran, it's really powerful to me personally, and I'm sure many in this room, to see all those generals and admirals speaking about the importance of using soft power for international development. My name is Todd Spear, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of a non-government organization, 501c3 nonprofit called Global Aid Consultants. We transform lives through education and health in developing countries around the globe. As an Army Ranger, a deep sea diver, a Special Forces Green Beret, and medical planner, and I feel kind of embarrassed to say all those things, but I've had the chance to see and experience firsthand the use of military and civilian tools in international development. I've had the opportunity to work around the globe, and specifically in Central America for many years. Many say that Central America has 3 of the most dangerous countries outside of a war zone in the world. These countries are in close proximity and directly impact Texas. Organizations like mine, organizations from across the country, organizations right here in Texas are working together with a common goal to make the world safer. We want to help prevent illegal migration, human trafficking, weapons and drug smuggling, and increase the prosperity of the area. Just to name a few. People in other countries, like you and me, want to live safe, healthy, and productive lives. Thanks to the leadership of Congressman McCaul and his initiatives, we have identified investments the U.S. can make to combat the root causes of violence and extremism that saves money, has a greater return on investment, and uses military power as a last result. It is for these reasons, and many more, military voices are some of the strongest advocates for America's development and diplomacy programs. I know many of my fellow veterans feel the same way and are here today. These men and women have sacrificed much in defense of our nation. They deserve our appreciation and support for their service to our nation. I ask my fellow veterans to please rise so we can salute you. Well, when America leads through development and diplomacy alongside defense, we all win, especially as a nation. And I know Jeff Mosley and other members of the Texas business community will agree.
Thank you, Todd. I certainly do agree, and what a delight to be here on this beautiful afternoon to see each of you to talk about the value of trade and growing jobs. And I am very, very pleased to be on the USGLC's Texas Advisory Committee and look forward to working with many of you in that capacity. The Texas Association of Business is almost 100 years of age. We have 2,500 businesses, and we are so excited that we're a part of this discussion of how to grow jobs in Texas through trade. You heard Liz mention just a while ago that 95% of our consumers live outside of the United States, and that's where our fastest growing markets are. So it really can't be overstated, the lunch we're having today and the discussions we'll have going forward about the value of growing jobs through trade. In fact, we might even argue that we believe in peace through trade, right? If we're trading with somebody, the chances are less likely we'll find an opportunity to get into a serious discussion or disagreement that might lead to a war if we're trading with them. So in order to advance American interests in these markets, we do rely on strategic investments. Those are investments in diplomacy, investments in economic development, and we really see a very, very important role for the private sector. And as Todd was saying, you know, we see a value in trade to help us fight corruption, to promote discussions on rule of law, and to open markets for Texans that are looking to go into these marketplaces. You might be interested to know that 900,000 Texans are working because of our trade relationship with Mexico and Canada. That's called NAFTA or USMCA, so we certainly have a value in fighting to get that document ratified, don't we? Those of us who call ourselves Texans. And at the Texas Association of Business, we also know very well that 1 in 5 American jobs are tied to international trade, and 1/3 of all of our manufacturing jobs are directly tied to our exports. And that's an important statement for those of us who call Texas home, because we're the leading exporting state. We have been for over a decade and a half. We're so honored today that Congressman McCaul is here as our featured guest presenter, because he, above all, understands what we've just been describing and talking about. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panel that will guide in this discussion that Liz will be moderating. We're really honored to have Ambassador Barbara Stevenson. She's the president of the American Foreign Service Association. We owe her a big thanks because she served as ambassador to Panama. And one day, Congressman, we probably need to build a monument to Panama, because they took the leadership to invest in enhancing their shipping lanes. And that was a huge gift to Texas, because now bigger vessels can come into our Texas ports, opening up trade with Asia. So, Ambassador, what a delight to have you. She served a 30-year tenure as an active duty member of the American Foreign Service, and also, in addition to Panama, a Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in London, and Deputy Senior Advisor to the Secretary and Deputy Coordinator for Iraq. Would you welcome Ambassador Stevenson to our panel? Ambassador, welcome. And joining Ambassador Stevenson, Bill Lane, a leading business advocate for free trade and global engagement. He served as Executive Director for Trade for America currently, and as Chair Emeritus of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I know Bill from his days working at Caterpillar, and he was there for over 40 years. Time goes by fast, doesn't it, Bill? But one thing I love about Caterpillar, and he can elaborate on this, as that assembly line is moving and these beautiful machines are being built by labor, by union workers, there's a sign on that piece of equipment saying, this equipment's going to India, this equipment's going to Panama, and it's showing the workers on the assembly line they have a direct relationship to exporting those goods. So please welcome Bill Lane. He'll be joining our panel. Bill? And we're so pleased that Liz Schreyer is here to bring this conference here, and she'll be moderating. Let's thank Liz. Liz, thank you so much for bringing the conference to Austin, Texas, and for your leadership. And it is a pleasure of mine to introduce a friend native to this Austin area. It's kind of unusual, isn't it, to meet somebody that's a native Texan anymore, but it's really unusual to meet somebody that's native to this area. But our congressman is really a wonderful leader who understands this area, and has been fighting for us. He's formerly the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. Some of us still call him chair, even though he's now serving as the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What a wonderful committee that is, to be there and be able to watch the business of the nation coming through that very powerful House committee. In just 2 months since being named the ranking member of Foreign Affairs, he's already become a very respected and powerful voice on issues ranging from tackling the root causes of extremism abroad. That's a full topic, isn't it? Expanding economic opportunities for women in the developing world, and helping Texas businesses engage overseas. And we appreciate his leadership on all of those. He's well-traveled, and if you have a chance after this lunch to visit with him and share some of your travel experiences, perhaps you'll find that he's already been there ahead of you because he's that seasoned and understands the value of getting out and talking to leaders around the world. So we're very, very pleased to have as our featured guest today, we'll call him today Chairman McCaul. We're so pleased to have you. Let's give him a warm USGLC welcome.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and the coalition. And, you know, we're hopeful we'll be chairman one day. But it is rare for a member to lead one committee and then lead another. And I feel very honored to be elected by my colleagues to serve. I actually find this committee assignment very exciting and very interesting. It's the second oldest committee in the Congress. And the first chairman was Benjamin Franklin, to give you some idea of what this committee does. And so, Liz, I want to thank you for that kind compliment about the freshmen. I like to be known as kind of the rational guy in the room, thoughtful, well respected, but they are just freshmen. I don't know. What do they know? But I'll work on it. And I've always thought if you don't get your foreign policy right and you put your military in there, and we have many examples historically. I saw Ken Burns at the Library of Congress. That was a magnificent documentary series. And where we made mistakes, both sides of the aisle. And that's what you want to avoid, because when you get your foreign policy right, you get your economic policy right, your trade policy right, and your national security policy right. And it's almost like a chess game. You got to get that chess game right before you start throwing the king's men in. The military should always be there as a last resort. Just like in Venezuela right now, we have a historic opportunity to transform and change what's happening in Venezuela to a democracy, free and fair elections, the people of Venezuela, to oust a socialist dictator Maduro. And it's within our grasp. It's within the people of Venezuela's grasp. And 54 countries have recognized the interim President Guaido. I hope we're successful, because that will change not only Venezuela, but Cuba and Bolivia and Nicaragua. It will change the Western Hemisphere for decades to come. Chavez and Maduro have destroyed what was a prosperous nation for 20 years into one of the biggest humanitarian crises and refugee crises we've seen in the Western Hemisphere. As I look globally, I only have a few minutes to talk, but you go from Russian aggression in Ukraine and Crimea and interference in our elections to China, their intellectual property, they steal. Huawei and ZTE, they steal, trillions of dollars in our intellectual property. I mean, they're in our research and development companies today, MD Anderson. They have a broad reach. But they also have something that we're going to talk about, I think, on the panel, and that's One Belt, One Road. And it is their desire to economically take over countries without a shot fired through over-leveraging these countries at a 3-to-1 return, where they go bankrupt, and then China takes them over. They've taken over ports. Sri Lanka, Djibouti, they have a port right next to our military base. And we'll talk a little bit more about this and what we can do to compete against the Chinese. Iran continues to be a serious threat. North Korea, And I'm meeting in this job with all the ambassadors and the foreign dignitaries, special envoys. I'm glad we're having a conversation with Kim Jong-un because the stakes are just too high. But I think we've been played for 3 administrations to the point where they do have ICBM capability. And we do think they have the miniaturized nuclear warhead to be able to deliver that intercontinental, and that means also to the United States. So we have to talk. They have stopped testing, which is positive, but it's going to be a very, I think, challenging, negotiation. Syria continues to be one of the most complex foreign policy challenges with no easy solution. I met with the Turks last week, and the Russians are in there. And we talked to them about, why are you buying Russian missiles and not American Patriots? And they said, well, sir, the Russians are there because you weren't. You weren't there. Sometimes the failure to lead and inaction can lead to destabilization, can lead to situations now like Syria. I was with a prisoner of war in the Assad's prisons. Elliot Engel, the chairman, and I were. And it was one of the most horrific stories I think I've ever heard. And we had the backdrop, we had the Holocaust Museum there, and these horrific pictures of people who have been tortured to death. He, by a miracle, escaped. But it's hard to imagine. My dad's generation was World War II. He flew as a bombardier in a B-17 and part of D-Day air campaign. And to go to Normandy, and it's the 75th anniversary this year, I intend to go again, was one of the most inspiring trips I've ever made. But then to see the horrors of what they were fighting when I went to Auschwitz, and I saw the gas chambers and the death camps, and Dr. Mengele doing his experiments on children, and the horrors of what the Nazis did. United States led, and we defeated evil and tyranny, the likes of which we haven't seen. But it's hard to believe that it's still happening today, that you can still have genocide in the world. And Syria is probably one of the most horrific acts of human torture and genocide is currently taking place. So we need to stop that. And I can go to Africa. If we look at counterterrorism, it's moving. We're having the last battles right now in the southern Euphrates, close to the Iraq-Syria border. I saw the rise and fall of the caliphate under my tenure as chairman of Homeland Security, but we got to keep an eye on where they're going now. And they're going to embed in Iraq and Syria, but they're going to Libya, and also a place that many of you know in the Sahel in Africa called the Sahel. It's the middle belt of Africa, and that's where we're seeing this extremism starting to take root. I introduced with Elliot Engel and Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Coons and I introduced the Global Fragility Act to get at the root cause of extremism. Too often, we helped stand up the Department of Homeland Security to defend the United States of America. Did a pretty good job. My threat briefings in 2015, 2016 were terrifying with all the external plots to kill Americans. Now the threat's gone down significantly. We've done a great job offensively with our military, going in and taking out, these extremists. Where we haven't done a good job, in my opinion, is on prevention. And I think, the Institute of Peace, I thank them for the task force report they gave us that we turned into legislation. And I know the Department of Defense is going to love this document. Because if we can stop putting the military in and go into war, that's always the better result. And this will help stabilize what are very destabilized countries where extremism can grow out of, and then we got long-term problems. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's why our investments, whether it be the Women's Economic Empowerment Act to Global Fragility to, investing in USAID, the BUILD Act is a huge piece of legislation that will help us with private and public overseas investment in these countries. And so, I look forward to a discussion about the legislation that we're moving in the Congress, and very bipartisan, as it should be. And I think, as a leader, the United States can make such a difference. If we become isolationists and we don't lead, then we fail, and the world fails. And if we cut our budget, which I'm opposed to, then we're going to have to do what Secretary Mattis so eloquently said, and that is buy more ammunition and bullets. And I think that speaks volumes from a former Secretary of Defense, and he's so right. Let me just close with, I spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations last Friday in New York, and I'm really happy to be home in Austin, Texas with this kind of weather. It is absolutely gorgeous out there, and for those of you out of town, enjoy the city. It's a vibrant, fun town. It's also, we got a lot of investment coming to Austin, but also the great state of Texas. So with that, I yield back, and thanks for having me.
I think we just saw why everyone listens. That was extraordinary in just a few moments to, hopefully we can get up here without falling. That was really extraordinary, and thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome, Barbara. Welcome,
Liz.
Bill. There are cards on your table that you can jot down notes, and we're going to get to your questions, but I'm going to ask a few to begin with. And as I was listening, Congressman, Mr. Chairman, I still call you Chairman too, Jeff. I do that all the time. So when you get back there, we'll just glide on through. I was listening to you, and as you were going through different parts of the world, there is so much conflict, there's so much fragility, so I'm going to pick up and start, if I can, on national security. We'll get to economics, we'll get to some of the other issues. And I'm going to start actually with a question to the audience and see how well you know what's going on in the world and how we're doing. And the question is, it's on the board. I'm going to put it on the board so you can get it. And you know the answers, so you're not allowed to answer. But decades ago, if we had been sitting here a decade ago, and I would say, 80% of our U.S. humanitarian aid was spent responding to natural disasters. That's a true fact. 80% of our aid, humanitarian aid, went to natural disasters. And my question is, what percentage of our humanitarian aid goes to natural disasters versus conflict or fragile states? Is it still 80%? Is it 50%? Or is it 20%? Okay? How many of you think it's still 80%? How many think it's 50% now? How many think it's 20%? This is such a smart group you represent. So it is 20%, and that's where I want to start the conversation and pick up on where you were just talking about. You and I were I was with you when you were at the press conference talking about this USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace report that talked about we're not investing much fragility. And one of the things that struck me is that some of these places, I was thinking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is one of the most conflict area zones in this world, in Africa. It's also where the spike of Ebola is coming from. This is a state that saw what happens if we don't stop Ebola overseas. There are going to be, by 2030, 2 billion people living in conflict zones. If we're going to fight global poverty, it's going to be in conflict zones. So you started this, you launched this piece of legislation you just talked about to focus on fragility. Why is that one of the first pieces of legislation, as ranking member of House Foreign Affairs, that you said, this is where we're going to focus on? Why is fragility driving your focus?
I think, to your point, because it's national security. It's also the right thing to do. As a humanitarian and human rights champion, but I really, as I see the threat evolving, and that's what I've always done my entire career, mainly in counterterrorism, I see that region of Africa, it's already destabilizing. That's why the military is briefing me saying this is going to be the next hotspot. If we don't get out in front of it and we don't lead, then we're going to have a serious problem coming out of the Sahel region. I think, great on the stats, right? So we're shifting more towards investment.
Yeah.
And so all these bills actually kind of weave together because you have global fragility, trying to stabilize these nations. You have the Champion Businesses Through Diplomacy Act, which
we're going to talk
Ambassador
about that.
Stevenson and I talked a great deal about, which is the first reason the Foreign Services formed in the first place is to advocate for American business abroad. That will stabilize. The BUILD Act puts OPIC on steroids to invest and stabilize. And then the Women's Economic Empowerment Act helps women through microfinancing in these impoverished areas to lift women up, and they can create so much to their economies. If we allow it to destabilize, we've seen time and time again in our history where the extremists will take hold where there is no governance.
So these are all part of how you're seeing address our national security and our economic interests. Barbara, I want to come to you on this. We showed a video. You're one of the most experienced diplomats in our country. You lead the Foreign Service Association. You have spent your career working side by side with some of the men and women in uniform. And you just saw a video of some of the most, impressive military leaders. And they are the most, strongest advocates for the civilian side. So what do they know that they're strongest to support your work? What is happening out there when you've been out there on the front line on the civilian side that our military voices are saying this is so important?
You know, Liz, I love it when you play those. Those are all some of my friends from my career,
right,
and they are our biggest supporters. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday, because that's the sort of thing a person like I do, that's called The General and the Ambassador.
Oh, that's a great podcast.
It's a great podcast series. And the General was actually talking about his experience working with our ambassador from Qatar, and about how he realized that the embassy was this enduring platform. It's there long before it becomes fragile and rises up on the conflict plane and goes through conflict, and that we're the enduring presence. And so he learned that he always wanted to go by the embassy and touch base before he had any meeting, because the embassy would have been following this for 20 years. We would know all of the key players. And the other point that he makes, and it's one of the things I love about the embassy as a platform, that platform, the chief of mission is able to use to bring together in an integrated strategy what the State Department is doing, the military is doing, the Department of Homeland Security elements who are overseas with us are doing. The IRS can be a very powerful tool for fighting bad guys. We're able to integrate all of that into a strategy to advance our interests. And when we all pull together like that, it's a powerful, awesome thing to behold. Our military are the best planners in our country. I just say that. They are awesome at their ability to plan in a sophisticated way. And when you bring the military into an integrated country strategy like that, America looks like a can-do country that could solve any problem and do it in a way that our values are honored. I think that's what those generals appreciate.
That's great. How many of you are in some kind of business that is exporting? The group. So, Bill, I want to turn to you, and I want to get back to the congressman. You mentioned your bill and how that fits in, but let me start with Bill. So you spent 40 years at Caterpillar. Yep. I've often heard you say that every road to development starts with a road. Obviously, a Caterpillar executive. A little self-serving. But one of the things that you've also said is that that there is a role for U.S. government to be playing, because if there are certain things, whether it's corruption, rule of law, there are certain things that government needs to do, but then if they do it well, they get out of the way, and then American business can do really well in the developing world. So why are hundreds of businesses been strong voices for development and diplomacy? What is it about this?
Well, first of all, the more you travel, the more you understand what's going on. But, let me just, put it in perspective. I started with Caterpillar in 1975, and Caterpillar was a big exporter. I mean, a really big exporter. But it exported to rich countries. Exported to Canada, to Europe, to Australia, and a few of the oil-producing countries. Those were the newly rich countries. I retired 2.5 years ago, and they're a bigger exporter now than ever before. But they export to the countries that were developing countries or USAID recipients 40 years ago. They export to Chile. They export to Peru. They export to Panama. 93% of the equipment in Panama to expand the canal was from the United States. Indonesia, South Africa. So in other words, the markets of the future tend to be the ones that are not the markets of the past. Rich countries are still important, but increasingly over half of the exports went to developing countries. Now, where are we? Right now we're in a great debate about trade barriers. And we tend to focus on the trade barriers that can be enacted in Washington or overseas. But one of the biggest trade barriers, and you see this everywhere, is the lack of infrastructure. And if you're in Haiti and you're driving through the rivers in a Toyota with a snorkel because it's better than the roads, you're really not going to get a lot of mangoes to market. I'm just telling you that right now. And you know, so you really do need to have the infrastructure. And what we've found is, well, probably the best example is there's another type of infrastructure which deals with health. And I was on a commission, and I was in northern Uganda in a little town called Lira, and it was coming back to life. This was in 2007. And the PEPFAR program, the program we talked about a second ago, was bringing this town back to life because all of a sudden people with AIDS were coming back. And people were euphoric. And people were naming their kids George, because George Bush was the one that was in charge of promoted the PEPFAR program. So I wrote a note to the White House, and I said, you don't realize this, but George Bush is more popular in northern Uganda than he is in Texas. And now remember, this was 2007, and the response I got back was, he's really not that popular in Texas right now. But he's not doing it to be popular. He's doing it because it's something he deeply believes in. And you're not to promote this. And so, you know, to me, when you think in terms of the Bush legacy, that's the one indisputable legacy. And people from Texas should be exceedingly proud of that.
It is. Everybody is. Absolutely. Here, here. Beautiful. Thank you. So let me come back to there's so many pieces of legislation that you rattled off. Not everybody may understand each piece, but I really want to give you a shout out on this, and I want you to just explain one piece of it. You were a major driver of something called the BUILD Act, and what it did is it enhanced our capacity to be more competitive in the world around development finance. But you said that wasn't enough. And you now have introduced a new piece of legislation called the I want to get it right, Championing American Business Through Diplomacy, so that you can even do more with it. I want both of you to address it. But why did you feel we needed to do more? What is it that you're trying to achieve to help American businesses out in the international arena? And then I want to ask you about the competitiveness. But what are you trying to achieve?
No, thank you. And I know the ambassador and I have talked about this bill. We're very excited about it.
I think it's fantastic.
It's long overdue.
This is really the playing field. This is really about our economic future.
Yeah, and let me just say, the embassies, we have what's called an in-country team briefing. Every time we go into a new country, it's the embassy. And they do a remarkable job getting all of the relevant players together. Some in classified space, some not. You know, we have our intelligence community, we've got law enforcement, we've got the State Department people, Homeland. It's really a true composite of all these entities, representing the United States of America overseas, and it really puts us into that country. And that's the very first meeting we have. And I just want to thank, what your people, foreign service officers, do. They do a great job.
They sure do.
And, so why do we do this? The BUILD Act put OPIC, which was failing, on steroids.
Yep.
It doubled the amount of funding, from 30 to 60 billion, and it got more of a private-public partnership moving to invest. Our goal is to eventually, we may not have to talk about foreign aid anymore if we can invest in these other countries. Mark Green talks a lot about this with USAID, but we're going to have it as long as we need it. But what Championing American Business Through Diplomacy does is, I think too often some diplomats, and not all, in some countries, really view that's not their responsibility. My responsibility is to deal with the host nation, not to advance American business interest. And so this creates a requirement, a training requirement, and a reporting requirement to the Congress on what are you doing. How did this even get to my attention? I was having dinner one night with 8 African ambassadors. And I said, China, I mean, they come in, they over-leverage with these payday loans, for lack of a better word to describe it, and then they cash in. They can't pay the loan, and they take over the country economically, again, without a shot fired, and they're taking over strategic ports. It's part of their One Belt, One Road initiative. And I asked them, why are you doing this when you know they're going to exploit you? It's short-term gain for long-term pain, and they know this. I mean, they know they're getting exploited, but they said, sir, you're not here. America is not investing in Africa right now. And so, we wanted to do something about that, to change that paradigm. And I think this bill will wake up our consular offices and diplomats that this is part of your job as well.
This One Belt, One Road initiative, if they fully fund it, it'll be 7 times what we spent in the Marshall Plan. So just put that in perspective. Right. So the kind of leadership that the congressman is doing is really about our economic future. So Ambassador, this competition, this great power competition, how does it play out in ambassador school, in ambassador chief of mission work? What's really happening? And then Bill, I want to hear it from the corporate side about what's really playing out, and then I want to turn to the humanitarian front before opening it up to everybody else.
So Liz, you in your video, in your slide, showed the picture of the shiny new airport with the Chinese written all the way across it. And as you said, this is not a one-off. This is happening all
everywhere. Latin America,
Africa,
it's true,
Latin
in Indonesia,
America.
you can see it pretty much anywhere in the developing world. Yep.
We had a recent panel at the American Foreign Service Institute on Economic Diplomacy Works, highlighting the critical role of diplomats, and we spoke about the champion American business through diplomacy during that. Ambassador Stu Jones, who was our ambassador in Jordan and then Iraq, is now a senior executive with Bechtel. And he told a story about, he said, now I read Engineering Digest. And he said Engineering Digest publishes an annual list of the biggest construction and engineering companies in the world. In 2008, not a single one of the top 10 was Chinese. Yep. In 2018, 8 of the top 10 are Chinese. Bechtel has fallen to number 12. And so this is part of what great power competition looks like. What we're starting to hear from our diplomats, very literally what the African ambassadors told the congressman, is that we're outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1 in terms of Chinese diplomats working on economic and commercial issues throughout Africa, also the Caribbean, also parts of Latin America. We are hoping that this bill, championing American diplomacy, American business through diplomacy, will provide an impetus for us at state to actually restore our economic diplomacy positions overseas. We moved them. I did it personally. I was in charge of the civilian surge for Iraq. We removed our economic officers. We sent them to the war zone in Iraq. We didn't have enough. It's the only way to cover the bases. Now we are drawing down in Iraq. It is time to put those diplomats back out in the field, championing American businesses and making the BUILD Act work on the ground. We cannot afford to cede whole swaths of continents to a competing power. Presence is influence. You cannot lead if you're not there.
Bill, do you want to jump in?
And Barbara showed me the original mission of the consular service, foreign service, was to promote American U.S. businesses. Interest abroad. And,
right.
And I thought that was very interesting.
We might have lost our way a little. There was a time where under a previous effort of something called economic statecraft, and they tried it, but you're taking it to another level. Bill, what about from the private sector? Are we getting it right, or is this going to happen?
Well, I mean, the question is, are we going to respond or not? I mean, first of all, there's a part of you when you're in Africa or what have you, and you see what the Chinese are doing. And you talk to folks there, and they go, we're desperate for infrastructure. We need clean water, we need better roads, we need airports. And then you say, well, we'll teach you how to build the road. And they go, fine. Well, we're really not going to do that because we're cutting funding. But we can tell you about how you could build the road. They said the Chinese will come in and just build the road. What's maybe even more concerning, the Chinese are getting better at development. They are not now bringing armies of workers over like they were just a couple of years ago. Now they're actually, sort of buying more. They're leveraging their money with locals and what have you. And this is something I think you should be a little concerned about. Thirdly, there's a couple things we can learn from the Chinese. My first involvement with China was Three Gorges Dam, biggest dam ever. Great to get in the interior of China. And my goal was to try to get XM funding, which we never got. And lastly was to endear myself, or endear Caterpillar, to the buyers on the project. And this one nice guy put his arm around me and said, I got to tell you something. He said, it's really a tough thing. It'd be better for us to have 100 people with shovels than one person with a Caterpillar bulldozer. We have a lot of people. And I go, did you ever think about 1,000 people with spoons? And he didn't think that was very funny. But he said, but you did make your point. They're not using spoons now. They're not using shovels. They are using modern construction techniques. And this is something, you know, I don't have a simple answer for you, but I'll tell you what we don't need to do is cut back and hide. And when you see these short-term budget requests that say we're going to cut foreign aid by 31% or 24%, that's the absolutely wrong way to respond to what the Chinese are doing. The better way to respond is to replicate what they're doing, invest in education, invest in infrastructure, and keep improving our competitiveness.
Let me do one more round real quick before getting to your questions. You mentioned we were together in the Oval Office when a very, I think, significant initiative was signed, the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, focusing on a bill that you also were leadership on about women economic empowerment and the investment in women. And it takes us into the beginning of the humanitarian conversation, something all three of you have played a leadership role in. One area that I want to talk about is one of my trips to Africa. I met our ambassador to, at that time, the African Union. It was in Addis Ababa, and his wife happened to be a pediatric oncologist. And she told me the statistic that a child who has cancer in this country, 80% chance of survival. A child in Africa who has cancer, a 10% chance. And she created and started to create the first ever cancer care center in Africa. You've taken this on. And you are actually working on trying to address pediatric cancer care in Africa. What is inspiring you? Why that issue, in addition to all these other incredible things that you're doing?
Well, you know, I started the Childhood Cancer Caucus about 10 years ago, and since that time we passed 4 major pieces of legislation. And it's a Creating Hope Act, which
how about that?
Has put billions into this. No, the Race Act, sorry, there are too many to mention. We're working on Lil Sadie, if you've ever seen her, is with me a lot. So she's going to be up at NIH talking about more funding. We only get 4% out of NIH. And so we're going to have a lot down the pipe. But I was in at Texas Children's in Houston, and the president of Botswana came in, and we talked about PEPFAR. And he said, you know, you saved my country from extinction. And that was very profound. And what Texas Children is doing is they're taking the PEPFAR sort of model, if you will, and applying pediatric oncology, childhood cancer, not only treatment, but research and development in places where it may not be as easy in the United States. So we're going to get a lot of good research and development clinical trials over there, but also, as you mentioned, the stats are absolutely astonishing. I mean, we have an 80%, the good news is kids in the United States have about an 80% rate of survival now, and they still have issues after survival. Yep. But in Africa, it's a death warrant.
It is.
90% die. And we think to sort of do what we did with AIDS in Africa, we can do with childhood cancer. That's the #1 killer of our children worldwide. And it is a humanitarian issue. I'm a Christian. It's something that is probably one of the most gratifying things we can do in Congress and as a nation. And you know, when you do stuff like that overseas, it leaves a strong influence on them, just like what you mentioned, you know, with George Bush.
That's true.
In Africa, and it will help us with our relationship as well, and it's going to save lives.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara, hard to do all these things if we don't show up. There are 80 ambassadors, positions in this sphere we're talking about that have not been filled. There's an op-ed I have coming out actually tomorrow. It calls on Congress and the White House to nominate and confirm. Does that worry you? Especially in these, when you got 30 million people on the verge of suffering from famine, 70 million people displaced in the world. There are not only huge conflicts that we're talking about, but huge humanitarian crisis. How worried are you about the fact that we aren't filling our ambassadorships, our key positions?
So you can't win unless you're there. That's absolutely right. Congressman Royce, your predecessor on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, used to tell a story about closing the American consulate in Kaduna in northern Nigeria, and you probably saved $10, and then we had to go back and actually try to put Boko Haram back in the bottle, and that cost you a fortune. And it also costs us American lives. And so you can't win if you're not there. The new national security strategy sort of makes clear that in addition to this long-standing, ongoing set of transnational threats, Ebola, famine, migration, drug trafficking, we have a new threat set, which is rising competition from other great powers. And that in order to compete, we actually have to up our game. And it's absolutely true. Liz, this feels to me and to many of my colleagues like we've done the diplomatic construction. You know, we've built some pretty strong, powerful embassies. They're very secure, and then we don't have the players on the baseball field. It feels a bit like a baseball game. We've got a good stadium, good security, but China's at bat. There's trouble all over the place, and there's nobody from the American team on second base and shortstop, and not surprisingly, it looks to me like China is just hitting line drives right down the hole in our team. I think we've got to get these positions filled at the leadership level and back at the mid-levels. The cheapest way to make America prosperous and safe is to just staff the embassies that you've built. So that is one of the things I'm really looking forward to being able to do. And once the Championing American Business Through Diplomacy Act passes, there's a really clear mandate in there that says that ambassadors will report on competition, because we have not been asked to do that. Senator Risch asked Dan Coates in the National Security briefing.
Is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the new chairman.
And Dan Coates is the director of national intelligence, and Dan Coates agreed. He said, it does feel like we were almost asleep for the last decade and a half, focused so much on counterterrorism that we missed this dramatic rise in capability from China. China has increased spending on diplomacy by more than 40% in the last 5 years. Our spending on core diplomatic capability fell by a third. We need to get back in the game because we're not only losing to great power competition, it is so much more cost effective for us to prevent these crises than it is for us to have to send in our military and have them put the genie back in the bottle.
And to sort of add on to that, my last threat briefing from the FBI Foreign Counterintelligence, they said, you know, our focus is moving from radical Islamist terror to China. And if that doesn't, to me, that just speaks volumes.
That really does.
About
that is a big
the new
change.
threat environment.
It is the new threat environment.
Let's take some of your questions. I'm going to come around and try to grab some of these here. And, okay. You're going to grab them. Let me see what we got here. Oh, my goodness. I'm going to have to try to read these. Okay. So, Bill, I'm going to start with you. Okay. And anybody can do it. But you are one of the greatest salesmen I know. And this is a question on what can we do to win the hearts and minds at home to build the groundswell of support on these issues. So how do you sell this?
Well,
Okay. And you're out there, people should know, excuse my back for the few of you, but people should know that Bill spends a lot of time selling trade. So trade and aid, how do you sell this? And tell your great cucumber
Well, I'll
story.
tell you, that's the challenge right now. I retired from Caterpillar, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, and the Farm Bureau picked me up to go around the country, do nothing in the Beltway, but get out into the country and talk about trade. But more than anything else, to listen. And I have to say, there's big parts of this country that feel like they've been overlooked. And they instinctively are pro-trade. They really are. I mean, I was in Omaha when the soybean tariffs went in effect. And it's going to devastate that area, or especially the soybean farmers. And a lot of them remember the Carter grain embargo. And I asked, how long did it take to recover? And they said, we never recovered. And so then I asked them, what do you think about the soybean? And they're saying, well, we believe in the president and we hope it works. But there's some quivering in their voice. And so the point being, we have to engage with people outside of Washington and what have you, and we have to listen. There's concerns out there. They want to be successful. I think there's a strong feeling that we all have to work with our allies on China. But there's also a strong feeling that we're supposed to treat our allies like allies. And whether it's Canada or Mexico or Germany or the UK, they are not a national security threat, and we need to work with them. And I also hear a lot that they don't want a car tariff either. So you know, there's a lot going on, but you don't hear this unless you get out of Washington and you get the real experts to start talking about these things. In this space, it's the faith-based community. They have some of the best aid programs in the country. In the trade deal, it's the businesses that do business overseas day in and day out. You need people to start engaging stakeholders.
I got a bunch of questions for both of the two of you, but Barbara, Secretary Pompeo said he wanted to bring the swagger back. So we want to know how he's doing. Did he bring the swagger back? And give us an example. You've been in a lot of tough places. You know, you've been to El Salvador, you've been to Panama. Give us an example. Like, how does this really make a difference? Are we bringing the swagger back? And give us one example. And then, Congressman, I have a bunch of questions about Central America. I'm going to come back to you on them. And if there's others, just poke your head up and I'll grab them.
How does it make a difference when we're there? That is such a great question, Liz. I'm going to do an El Salvador story from way back in my early days.
And if you want to put a little swagger in it, go ahead.
There's a little swagger in there. We ran a series of programs in El Salvador, which was torn by civil war. And part of what we did was help the Salvadorans put in place an electoral registry and a voter process so that they actually had the tools to run democratic elections that the people of El Salvador had confidence in. It's amazing. It's endured all the way to this day. I'm talking about the early 90s. Once people were able to vote and go to the polls and vote for their elected representatives, lo and behold, interest in fighting diminished really quickly, and we got a peace deal. When we went back to look at the good that we had done with our aid programs in El Salvador, we noticed an outsized return on a small program we had. It was Mayors in Action. It had been really hard to get someone from a town in a conflictive zone where the fighting was going on to step forward to run for mayor of the town. Because what do you think happened to someone who stepped forward to run for mayor of the town? That's right, they were killed by the FMLN. So it required someone of great courage to step forward. We, at the embassy, the AID mission, were able to give a $100,000 small grant to when a mayor would step forward, and all they really had to do was hold a town meeting, agree what they were going to build, and then put their own equity into it. Sometimes it was sweat equity, sometimes it was the sand for the concrete. This was such a successful program, as it was democracy in action. It was that local level cycle of democratic accountability. And when all was said and done, for a very small investment, we had clinics and retaining walls and basic schools all over El Salvador. And you know what else we had? A whole new generation of leaders who had stepped forward not because they had any interest in power per se or lining their pockets, because they wanted to deliver for their community. It was a wonderful program to be part of, and I got to be there when the peace agreement was signed. James Baker came down to El Salvador. Everyone gathered from the Supreme Court to the National Assembly, and there was a moment there, which is still kind of one of my great moments of a 34-year career, when the president of El Salvador walked past all of those people and put his hands on my shoulders and gave me the kiss, the besos, and said, "Thank you for what you did to bring peace to my country." It's not quite like naming all the boy children George, but it's up there.
It's pretty close. It's pretty close. That's great. That's awesome.
That's awesome.
So, Congressman, there's a bunch of questions here about Central America, and you know, I have noted one of the things I wrote an op-ed actually last summer about this topic is that there's a lot of debate, obviously, in this state about borders and all those. But there's not enough discussion, and these are, I'm pulling from about 3 questions, about root causes. That we spend about $1 billion on the symptom, what happens at the border, and we spend less than $1 million actually on the root causes, on why a parent actually puts a child at risk and brings them to the border. Can you talk about, I assume you have traveled to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Can you talk about what is our strategy, if we have a strategy, to invest in programs that are trying to partner with the governments, as difficult as that is, to say we want to try to help. People want to stay home. We know people want to stay in their home.
Just as the some of these bills deal with more Africa to stabilize and take extremism out. I think this is our own hemisphere. And I think we've neglected our own hemisphere.
Yep.
For quite some time, as we focus on Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, and which are, deserves our attention. But in terms of, well, first of all, let me just say the family separation, I think, was the wrong policy. And I don't think that's the face of America. And I think it will go down in history as a black mark. And I don't think we should be doing that. And I've said that very often publicly. Yeah. Second, though, back when I was a federal prosecutor, it used to be more kind of like people coming to work, and now we're seeing a difference in Central American family units coming up because the conditions are so bad in Central America. And Elliot Engel, the chairman, and I are going to take a trip to Colombia, to the Venezuela border, where we're seeing 3 million refugees coming out.
Yep.
You can imagine what's going to happen. But the idea a parent would give a coyote $6,000 to take their daughter or child up through this dangerous journey where they get, manipulated, exploited in many ways. It shows you that there's something not right down there. I think El Salvador has a good story to tell, and we'll be visiting. I see the presence of Argentina, Brazil, El Salvador, all becoming friendlier to the United States of America, where it used to be very hostile down there. And I do think we have an opportunity with Venezuela, as I talked about, and with Cuba. But there's a Central American Security Initiative. There's also the Merida Initiative that Henry Cuellar, our congressman from Laredo, and I started in the House to provide kind of rule of law, but also assistance to Mexico to stabilize. The Central American Security Initiative is another one to try to stabilize. We don't want to just pour money into corrupt governments. That's right. We got to do this smart from a taxpayer standpoint. But one of my goals of this Congress is to really address the root cause of why they are coming up. Why are all these children coming up to the United States? I know why they are. Right. And if they're running from gangs and violence and poverty, that has to change. And we need to be a partner with them to help make that change.
And one of I pick up on that, and Bill, you know a lot about this, is one of the greatest success stories is Plan Colombia, right next door. And Bill, you were very involved in that. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
In Washington, and a lot of people, whenever they want to come up with a program that's worked, they always focus on 3 programs. The Apollo program, the Manhattan Project, and the Marshall Plan. Yeah. Maybe there's only 3. Maybe that's all there are, and that's why they always talk about the same one. But Plan Colombia is one that deserves to be on that list. And if you go back 20 years, Colombia was on the verge of being a narco-terrorist state. It was disintegrating on a bipartisan approach. It was Speaker Hastert, it was President Clinton. They worked together. We got bipartisan votes. About half the money went to improving the military and security. The other half went to civil society initiatives. Eventually, we got a free trade agreement. If you pull, and it was a robust. This was not inexpensive. This was, $900 million a year, something like that. If you pull it all together over the 12, 14 years, it's equivalent to 3 weeks in Iraq. And it worked. And we have a democracy down there. We have an ally. A lot of it goes to the Colombians, Uribe, later on Santos, who played a really big role. You had good leadership down there, but it was bipartisan, it was sustained, and it was robust, and it reflects one of the great success stories. And I would guess if you go around the country, and there's probably a lot of people here from the military that played a role in either training or developing. But if you go around the country, few people realize that we can still do it, but we need to do it in a certain way which is bipartisan and sustained.
But I do think when I talk about Venezuela, there's a lot of, we want to support Guaido, but I don't think they want to see him as a puppet of the United States. And that's always a downfall in Latin America. And this needs to be driven by the people of Venezuela, but also by the Lima Group and the OAS.
Which was great.
And I think we can have the same partnership with Central America to do something like a Marshall Plan. And it would, in terms of investment, return on investment, it would I think, be extraordinary.
Let me do two last questions, and I want to pick. There are a whole bunch of questions about how we can take the energy in this room and engage a whole slew of people. There was everything from the Rotary clubs, which are very active with us, but I want to pick up on spring break and the students, because there was a whole bunch of questions about the next generation. Are they applying? And your constituents, where the next generation is about engaging and thinking about international engagement from the business community. So maybe just real quick, if each of you can touch on kind of the young people in this country and where they are in international engagement, then I'm going to ask one last question to close up before Jonathan Freddy does. So where's the next generation when it comes to foreign service and what you're seeing?
The next
generation, I know we just talked about, what do you have, I just want to add, you have a lot of students that are really engaging in the international arena. It's great, great.
The next generation is still interested in joining the Foreign Service. We will have about 10,000 people take the Foreign Service Officer test, and we'll hire under 300 Foreign Service officers. So it's still a huge pool that is interested in joining a very small hiring class. It has been 22,000 in the past, and so I don't take 10,000 lightly. I'd like to see the higher number, but I will say still large numbers of young people are interested in joining us at state and at aid. The hiring numbers are small. We're very tiny agencies is really what this is. There's all kinds of other ways, though, to be part of this project than there were when I was coming through. I mean, you can do things with Caterpillar and with Procter & Gamble and with the variety of NGOs who are in this room. And I try to get young people to remember that there are many, many ways to be part of the network that sustains American global leadership.
Bill, you used to teach a class, and
you were one of the best guest speakers, and you never charged.
I like the wine I got from it. Chilean wine, usually. Right, I remember. But do you find the energy of the young people as you're going around the country talking about trade? Is there an isolationist pull or international pull?
No, I mean, it's really, they're outward looking. I do an awful lot with Penn State. We're a big Penn State family. And I lead their global Penn State effort as far as inbound and outbound students. Students now, they don't want to just go on a foreign studies program their junior year. They want to go their freshman or their sophomore year, and then again their senior year. One of our challenges was, why don't you go to Peru instead of Paris? That's still a hard sell, by the way. But all in all, they really are outwardly engaged, and they're more so than I've ever seen before. And just incidentally, we really do try to model ourselves after the University of Texas. You are the leading edge on what's going on in this. No state is more outward looking than Texas. You have the best trade numbers of any other state. You do more business with Mexico and Canada. You do more in the NGO world. I mean, this is really the epicenter. And if we can use this as sort of the model around the country, I think we have a really, really bright future. You also have the best business climate in the country as well. So anyway.
Thank you.
I think you just got your poster child for the sales room. What are you seeing with the
millennials?
When you go around to the state, people intrigued? Is there energy around?
Yeah, I wrote this book, Failures of Imagination, not to plug it, but it was what kept me up at night.
You can plug it.
It was like, what keeps you up at night? So I wrote a book about it, and I went to the LBJ school, and they read it, and we had a conversation about it. What the political science professor told me was a little disheartening. He said, there's no interest, they have no interest in going into politics these days.
Really?
And I think it's because politics has gotten so polarized and so nasty. But they are interested in humanitarian issues. They're interested in foreign policy. And I think foreign policy has never been more relevant than it is today. So I have great optimism that we will continue to have recruits in the State Department. It's a pretty rigorous examination process.
It is.
And as it should be. But I think the role of the NGO, as Barbara mentioned, is so important for us to elevate the role of the NGOs all across, this country and across the world that can really be an arm or extension of the State Department is so important. I see sister over there with the results, and you know, groups like that. That you know, she holds my feet to the fire because she remembers when I was an altar boy. And
did he do okay?
Yeah, so I want to thank her for they visit members of Congress's office and they talk about real issues, and that's important.
So let's end here. Is this? We've been talking about some pretty rough spots: Venezuela, Syria, the famines. You three are three of the most optimistic people that I have met. You've traveled the world. You probably, between the three of you, have been to every corner of the world. Pick one story, one moment that gives you hope, because you are starting to talk about some pretty optimistic components of the world. Bill, you start, and I'm going to ask you. These are short stories. So, because he's one of the great storytellers, but I know him.
Maybe.
No, short story.
So I go down to Honduras, and there's all these aid programs going on to diversify, agriculture, because everyone's selling rice or beans, and it's winter vegetables, and it's cucumbers, and it's sweet potatoes. And you sit down with the farmers afterwards, and you go, hey, what do you make the most money on? They have about 2 hectares, 4 acres. And this one woman says, the money that we make the most, I said, that's legal. And she says, the thing we make the most on is cucumbers. She said, there's 8 weeks in the winter that we own the American cucumber market. And I said, boy, that's really great. I liked her passion. So I come home, we're having a cocktail party, and I'm telling the story, and this one woman who's married to a naval officer, and she says, I noticed you can get cucumbers in the winter now, but they cost $1 each. If I knew that money was going to her, I'd be buying cucumbers all the time. I'd be buying pickles. But she said, I didn't know that. Nobody tells that story. Well, the rest of the story is the MCC, and I think it was when you were down there, all of a sudden put in a north-south highway to get the cucumbers and other things to market. And then they had to modernize the Port of Cortez. That all took Caterpillar equipment. There's nobody at Caterpillar that knew that because of that woman having a crop of profitable cucumbers, it was resulting in more sales in Peoria, Illinois. We have to be able to tell the story a lot more comprehensively.
All right, I'll go out and buy cucumbers in the off-season. That's great. Barbara?
Liz, I think I probably already told my story in some ways. There's nothing quite like being thanked for bringing peace to a country, and that's happened to me more than once, certainly El Salvador, and I also had the great honor of working on bedding down the peace process in Northern Ireland, and we've just wrapped up St. Patrick's Day, which is a week in Washington, where everyone from Ireland, North and South, comes over, and the degree of gratitude that there is for our country, for George Mitchell's role in negotiating and America's, for the transformation of policing. I can't tell you what it's like to be thanked for that. I want to go on a macro level, though. We've mentioned Colombia, and I'm so glad we have Bill, because it is a great success story. I just want to talk about Korea for a second. One of my best friends in the Foreign Service, Kathy Stevens, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Korea in the 1970s, and then she was a junior officer in the embassy in Seoul when the military dictatorship gave way to democracy. And then she was our consul general in Busan. And she went back years later, while I was ambassador in Panama. We did our free trade agreements together, she Korea and I Panama. And it's a prosperous country. And I was invited, actually, at one point to go over to Korea to thank them. Are you ready? For sending and staffing and running a provincial reconstruction team in northern Iraq during that war. So you think about this. This partner, Korea, went from the poverty right after the Korean War all the way up to being an ally, a donor, and part of the effort to actually bring us to a successful conclusion in Iraq. It's quite a journey, and it's one we should celebrate.
And I just want to celebrate. I want to tell you one thing about Barbara, about Ambassador Stevenson. She is leaving her post as president of the American Foreign Service Association to take yet another duty and to serve our country as our deputy head of the mission in Iraq starting in July. So on behalf of America, thank you.
I'm delighted to get this job. It's a great honor. Thank you all.
And to close our storytelling out, Mr. Chairman.
I've been to so many hot spots and been fired upon, and just crazy codels, and during time of war. But I remember being in Kandahar. It was right on the border of Pakistan, and they, General Huggins was there, Ambassador Crocker, who, boy, talk about a guy who's been through stuff. He was the ambassador
very proud to be
in
on our advisory
Lebanon
committee.
during the Beirut Marines episode, to Syria, the last one in Syria, to Iraq, Afghanistan, maybe
Iraq.
Yeah, and Iraq. I mean, he said, "What am I doing wrong?" Because I ended up. But I think out of all the ambassadors, that guy, tremendous respect, and he's the brightest man you'll ever talk to. He knows so much about these issues. But I mean, here we are in Afghanistan, this remote place, and they brought us out to a little village, and all these kids came in and just came up to us, and they gave us hugs. And I do think, even in the harshest places, that America can have an influence and make a difference in the lives of children and others. And I think as we embark on these investments that we're talking about, I think it's important they know it's the United States behind us, right? Mark Green told me USAID comes in, they can't put an American flag.
Yep.
So I think they need to know where the goodwill and the investment and the humanitarian assistance is coming from, because that just gives us a better face globally and a better brand.
Ambassador, Bill, Congressman, thank you all for not only being here today, but what you do day in and day out to make our world a safer, a better, a more prosperous place. Join me in thanking you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Oh, I love it.
Really good seeing you.
And to close our program for just the last 2 minutes is the person who really put this all together is my colleague, Jonathan Freddy.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Freddy. I'm the Regional Director for the USGLC for Texas and Oklahoma. And as most of you know, jfreddy@usglc.org. Congressman McCaul, thank you so much for joining us in an important and timely discussion. We are very grateful for your leadership and support of the programs, especially your new resolution recognizing the interdependence of development, diplomacy, and defense on the House floor. Incredibly important and cannot be overlooked. Thank you to Beth, Judge Mosley, Todd, Ambassador Stevenson, and Bill Lane for rounding out and contributing to today's discussion. And thank you to my colleague, Liz Schreyer, for guiding the conversation, as well as to our partners and our advisory committee members who made today possible. Thank you all so much. Interacting with you all is my favorite part of my job. USGLC is nothing without your help and your participation, and Texas is an integral part of our global community. So many of you are doing such important work, and we look forward to continuing our partnerships from here. So where do we go? When you have members like Congressman McCaul doing fantastic work, drop his office a note. I know his staffers would appreciate it. Thank him for his leadership. Thank other members from our Texas delegation for their fantastic leadership on these issues that are so important to our state. Last year, USGLC met with candidates and members in the House and Senate all across the country. We wrote op-eds, letters to the editor, and spoke out on local radio stations. So we want you to join in and grow our voice. Send a thank you to the offices, highlight it for your local newspapers, call into radio stations, and make it a dinner table topic. Speak with your families about what you've heard today, and let us know who else we can bring into this conversation. You're an important piece of this conversation, and we need to continue it and amplify that voice. To that note, June 17th and 18th is our annual State Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C., our signature event of the year where we bring all of our leaders from the states, all 30 states that we work in, and veterans from across the country to Washington to amplify your voice. And I will be back in Austin the week of May 20th for an event with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and I would love to see as many familiar faces as possible there. Thank you again for your continued support for USGLC. And as an organization, we lose all of our firepower without having you guys as involved as possible. If you haven't gotten a card from me, please come see me as soon as we're done here. Thank you all so much. Congressman McCaul, it's an honor to share the stage with you. Thank you all so much.